Hello and welcome to a three-part video series that I will be doing on the topic of gender and transgender issues. I've been absolutely shocked how fast things are moving in our society as it relates to these things. We are being asked to believe and accept things that just 10 years ago would have seemed absolutely insane. And the stakes are high because if we don't drink the Kool-Aid and follow along like mindless sheep, we're labeled bigots and hateful people. And I'm neither of those things. I'm simply skeptical of the claims that are being made about gender and the transgender. I've done some research to better understand this. I'm going to share that with you in this video and two others that will follow. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to present this in three parts. Part one, we'll look at the terms, definitions, and the key statistics that I think are very important to understand to do this topic justice. I will try to my best to keep my opinions out of this. I simply want to present these words and statistics as they're commonly used today in the mainstream. Then in part two, which is a second video, I'll provide analysis and commentary on the things that I present in part one and then draw my own conclusions. That will be full of opinion. Then in part three, I'm going to take a scriptural perspective. How should a Christian, believing in the Bible, look at these things, treat the transgender community with love and compassion, and yet remain true to our call to be salt and light? And now, part one.
Our first definition is sex. Easiest one to get your head around because it is objectively verifiable. Also known as assigned sex or biological sex, it's ultimately the label that you're given at birth based on medical factors. So beneath the surface, there's chromosomes and hormones, and then blatantly obvious are your genitals. So a doctor will look at a baby, verify whether it has a penis or a vagina, and will then call it a male or a female and assign it a sex. Gender is considered to be a social construct. It has to do with all the expectations that society has about the behaviors, thoughts, and characteristics that go along with a person's assigned sex. This includes the stereotypes that people in society associate with a particular gender, like the job they do, their hairstyle, the clothing they wear, the sound of their voice, the activities they behave in or engage in. It has nothing to do with their assigned sex at birth or their genitalia. Your gender identity is based upon how you feel inside. So regardless of what sex you were assigned at birth, you are the gender that you feel you are. And your gender expression refers to how you present your gender to those around you. And you can do this through clothing, your behaviors, your style of hair, the sound of your voice. And it's also helpful to understand the claim that gender is a spectrum. At one extreme of the spectrum is male, at the other extreme is female. And a person can fall at any point along that spectrum. Usually a person falls in the direction of one or two of the extremes and identifies as either male or female, but there are some that fall in the middle and identify as neither, and some claim to be off the spectrum entirely. The term transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or their gender expression is different from the cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. So a person assigned male at birth, based on having a penis, may identify or express themselves as a woman. So someone whose gender identity doesn't match to the sex they were assigned at birth is considered to be a transgender person. The term cisgender refers to a person whose gender matches to the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you were labeled a male at birth because you had a penis and you grow up and you still identify as male by gender, then you were considered cisgender. You match the gender you were born with. The word cis comes from the Latin. It means on this side of, whereas trans means on the other side of. A trans man is a man who was assigned female at birth. So biologically is a woman, has a vagina, but identifies as a man. A trans woman is a woman who was assigned male at birth. Biologically a man, has a penis, but identifies as a woman. Gender queer is a catch-all category for gender identities that are not exclusively male or female. So within the gender queer category would be gender non-binary, which is a person that identifies as neither male nor female. They fall right in the middle of that spectrum. And gender fluid would be a person who prefers to remain flexible about their gender identity rather than committing to a particular or single gender. They can float back and forth between male and female. Preferred gender pronouns are the pronoun or set of pronouns that an individual would like others to use when talking to or about them. And there are really no limit to the number of pronouns that could be made up or insisted upon, but the most common are the traditional he, she, or they, them, used in the singular though, and new pronouns such as zimzer. Now, if a transgender person has requested a particular pronoun be used for them, if you misuse that pronoun, that can be called misgendering. So misgendering occurs when you intentionally or unintentionally refer to a person, relate to a person, or use language to describe a person that doesn't align with their affirmed gender or preferred pronoun. So that's misgendering. And making this mistake can be considered what's called a microaggression, which is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against a member of a marginalized group.
To be transphobic means that you have a dislike or a prejudice against the transgender community or against a transgender individual, or it's also used to label someone who simply doesn't agree with what they're told they have to accept and believe when it comes to gender issues and transgender rights. And I got a little guy in the screen screaming because he's got a phobia.
Now we'll take a look at the medical diagnosis that could be applied to someone who is transgender. So is being transgender itself considered a mental illness or medical condition? Based on popular consensus, the answer is no. What's considered to be a mental illness is what's called gender dysphoria, and that's the clinically significant distress that a transgender person feels because their gender identity does not match their biological sex. So because of that incongruity between gender identity and biological sex, a transgender person can suffer significant distress. That is called gender dysphoria, and that is considered the mental illness. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM-5, lists gender dysphoria as a mental illness. That manual used to list what was called gender identity disorder, which is the actual fact of being transgender. It used to list that as the mental illness, but then in 2013 it removed gender identity disorder and replaced it with the current diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And that is far more than just a change in name. It has a huge impact on how a person is diagnosed and then what treatments are prescribed based on that diagnosis.
When gender identity disorder was listed in the DSM-5 as a mental illness, it indicated that it was the actual condition of being transgender that was the mental illness. Then the change in 2013 to remove identity and replace it with gender dysphoria, that indicated that being transgender was no longer a mental condition, but instead, if being transgender caused you significant mental distress, that distress is considered to be a mental condition. Now, this change has had significant impact on how a transgender person can be treated. When it was a disorder, it can be treated with psychotherapy to try to bring one's gender identity back in accord with their biological sex. But as a dysphoria, psychotherapy can only be used to treat the feelings of distress resulting from the incongruence between identity and biological sex, or used as a support to help someone through their gender transition. Now, this change in categorization, or name change, wasn't due to new research or scientific discovery. Instead, it was due to transgender activism. Gender identity disorder was removed and replaced with dysphoria because the identity disorder was considered to be stigmatizing if it was categorized as a mental illness. Now, some have argued that having gender dysphoria as a mental illness is still stigmatizing to the transgender community, but it's been left in the DSM-5 because a diagnosis of some type is necessary to ensure access to medical care, so surgeries, hormone treatments, or counseling. And this is especially important if a transgender person is trying to seek reimbursement through medical insurance. If it isn't labeled some type of medical condition, then there's no insurance coverage. There are conditions that have to be met in order to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. You have to experience at least 2 of the symptoms that are listed below, and those symptoms have to have persisted for a duration of at least 6 months, and the condition must be associated with clinically significant distress or impairment. I'll pause for a moment to let you read through the list of things on the screen. Once you've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, you can begin your gender transition. So a gender transition is a process by which someone strives to more closely align their internal gender identity with its outward appearance. And this can involve psychological counseling to help support you through changes in your lifestyle, electrolysis or laser hair removal, hormone treatments, plastic surgery, or sex reassignment surgery. Okay, I'm done with definitions. I'm going to finish off this video with some key statistics that I believe are relevant to any serious study of gender and transgender issues. And I won't draw any conclusions based on these statistics at this time in this video, but in video number 2, I will analyze them and then provide some commentary and draw some conclusions based on them. The first stat is that transgender people make up 0.6% of the US population. Of the transgender population, 41% of them will attempt suicide. That's compared to 4.6% of the general population in the US that will attempt suicide. That is 9 times the rate of the general population. And that's not unique to the US. In Australia, the number is 51%, and in Britain, it's 48% of the transgender population that will attempt suicide. And the reason that's commonly given for this trend is that because of discrimination and threats or acts of violence against the transgender community, this causes many of them to attempt suicide. Now I'm going to look at suicide rate comparisons between post-op transgenders, so that's transgender individuals that have undergone sex reassignment surgeries, and compare their suicide rates to the suicide rates of other marginalized groups in history. I'm going to compare those to Jews living in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1939, as well as to the suicide rates among Black American slaves in 1850. I believe these are 3 comparables, 3 groups that have had extreme persecution. So 2 studies were done in Sweden and in Germany on suicide rates among the transgender. And they showed that 270 to 800 suicides per 100,000 people within that post-op transgender community. Even if you take the low number of 270, that's extremely high, considering that Jews under Nazi rule experienced 158 suicides per 100,000 people, and among Black American slaves, less than 1 person per 100,000 people attempted suicide. And that's compared to a US general population where 11.5 people per 100,000 commit suicide. And now I'd like to present some additional statistics that were collected by the Swedish study that I presented on the prior slide, that they collected as they tracked a population of post-op transgenders, so transgender individuals that had already had sex reassignment surgeries. This study compared them to a control population. They found that the suicide attempt rate was 8 times that of the control population. Death by suicide was 27 times that of the control population. Risk of death by any cause was 3 times that of the control population. And the risk of substance abuse was 3 times that of the control population.
Now, on this screen, I've included a list of resources that I consulted in putting together the content for this video, and you're free to review those resources. And you may wish to challenge some of the statistics that I presented. But if you'd like, review the research. I've given you the links. It's available. And I know that no study is perfect, and there will be degrees of error within any statistics that you calculate. But when I looked at all available research, even research that I didn't cite within this video, they all paint the same type of picture. They're all skewed in the same direction. So I think the evidence clearly indicates that we should care deeply about the welfare of anyone suffering through gender dysphoria. And as Christians, we should be especially exercised on how to show love and compassion to those in the transgender community. That doesn't mean that we must accept or agree with everything we're being told to believe or think when it comes to gender or transgender, but disagreement should never keep us from caring. So look forward to the next video where I'll analyze some of this data and draw some conclusions. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to comment below and click subscribe. God bless.